Picture this. You're walking into a boxing ring, surrounded by thousands of people. Cameras are flashing. Broadcasters are already writing your defeat. The commentators dismissing you. The newspapers mocking you. Even your fellow fighters laughing at you. Nobody thinks you have a chance, except for one person. You. That was George Foreman on January 22nd, 1973. The world saw him as a sacrificial lamb stepping into the ring with Joe Frazier, the undefeated heavyweight champion, the man who went to war with Muhammad Ali for 15 rounds. The outcome was supposed to be obvious. It wasn't. And what happened next? Oh, my friend, that's where things get interesting. When Frazier and Foreman set up their training camps in Jamaica, the top song on the charts was You're So Vain by Carly Simon. Stevie Wonder's Superstition had just moved up to second place on the top 100 during Fight Week. It was the perfect soundtrack for what was about to happen in the Sunshine Showdown. In Frazier's camp, sports writer Dave Wolf noticed that the champion sometimes ignored instructions from his trainer, Eddie Futch. Instead, he'd look at his fists and say, "I lay my hands on them, and they fall." Meanwhile, journalist George Plimpton visited Foreman's camp for Sports Illustrated and described it as gypsy atmosphere filled with fortune tellers, dreamers, and people reading tea leaves. Vanity versus superstition. That's how some people saw it. To many, it looked like Foreman had brought his trainer, Doc Broadus, more for luck than strategy, and that hiring former champion Archie Moore was less about boxing knowledge and more about having a wise old storyteller around. The truth? There were plenty of strange things happening in Foreman's camp. One of the weirdest was how Moore wrapped George's fists with so much tape under his gloves that they looked comically huge. Then there was the unusual training. While his coach held onto a heavy bag, Foreman would pound it over and over again with punches that looked like the old shovel hook technique used by Jack Dempsey. His trainer clung to the bag like a sailor holding onto a pole in the middle of a storm. The sound of Foreman's punches was like thunder, and watching him hit that bag, leaving his fist imprints on it, was downright scary. But to outsiders, it looked more like an attempt to scare people rather than a real training strategy. Even Muhammad Ali's hype man, Bundini Brown, showed up in Jamaica, saw the way Foreman's hands were wrapped, and wondered if they were broken. After watching the heavy bag drill, Bundini laughed and said, "What's the point of that? He's hitting something that doesn't move. Frazier's not going to stand still for him." Frazier wasn't impressed either. He was too busy hanging out with Playboy models, competing in a mini Olympics on TV, and making sure his music group, the Knockouts, got their fair share of attention. His focus wasn't on Foreman, it was on a future rematch with Ali. Even sports writers didn't take the fight seriously. Gene Courtney from the Philadelphia Inquirer didn't just overlook Foreman, he acted like the fight was already over before it started. He wrote that Foreman winds up his right hand like he's starting an old Model T car, and that he'd never land a clean shot on Frazier. Other journalists weren't so blunt, but they all had the same conclusion: Foreman didn't have a real chance. The betting odds reflected that feeling. Boxing experts wrote article after article, making it sound like Foreman's defeat was already set in stone. No matter where you looked, local sports pages, national columns, boxing magazines, nobody gave George more than a slim puncher's chance. Some writers played it safe, saying that maybe if Frazier had taken too much damage in his fight with Ali, Foreman could possibly get lucky. But most experts were blunt about it. Former heavyweight champ Jersey Joe Walcott said, "Frazier will eat him alive." Ken Norton, a top contender, didn't hold back either. "He stinks. He's going to need a lot of luck. He'll last 5 rounds. The only boxing legend who openly supported Foreman, aside from the people on his payroll, was Joe Louis. But Louis had money problems and often took advice from Vegas oddsmakers on who to pick just to help get more bets placed. So when Louis suddenly backed Foreman, despite never even seeing him fight live, it made people wonder if he really meant it. But Louis stood by his words, telling journalist Will Grimsley, "I gotta give the kid a shot." Back then, having Joe Louis pick you to win was basically a bad omen. Foreman, however, wasn't interested in being the underdog. When reporters asked him about his slim chances, he fired back. "Take it back," he snapped at one journalist. "I ain't no dog," he growled at another. Meanwhile, when Frazier was asked what kept him motivated, he talked about money, his plantation in South Carolina, his plans to buy land in Philadelphia, and how his kids always needed things like new shoes. Foreman, on the other hand, had a different story. He reminded the press that he never even had shoes growing up. We were not poor, but po. We used to jump on a rich boy in a minute. The memories of his rough childhood boiled up inside him, and he finally burst out, "I'll whip his head until it ropes like okra." One sports writer thought Foreman's training looked so bad that he was faking it. He even asked his trainer, "Are you doing your real training in secret?" There was some truth to the question. Foreman's camp was full of odd moments, but it was also much more serious than people realized. Archie Moore played the role of a wise old man for the media, but behind closed doors, he was the key trainer. He wrapped Foreman's hands before practice, massaged his muscles afterward, and shared stories from his long career, fighting legends like Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano. He treated Foreman like a champion before he even became one. That focus was so intense that Foreman even skipped celebrating his birthday and missed the birth of his daughter, Mishi. His wife wanted to name her Georgiana after a friend, but Foreman refused. He wasn't ready to name anything after himself yet. He hadn't made his name mean something yet. Foreman's training camp became almost too serious. His sparring partners kept getting injured. Sand poured out of heavy bags from the force of his punches. "All I knew was training," some Foreman later said. The big question was whether this intensity would help him against Frazier, or if it would just send him straight into Joe's smokin left hooks. When the fight finally started, Foreman threw a big, wild right hand that missed and left him open for Frazier's deadly left hook. Frazier's best weapon, announcer Howard Cosell reminded the audience. Foreman is vulnerable to the hook. But Frazier didn't take advantage of the opening. Instead, he bobbed, weaved, and faked punches to try and throw Foreman off. Meanwhile, Foreman tried to push and pull Frazier around like he was wrestling instead of boxing. The commentators noticed something odd. Frazier wasn't as aggressive as usual, and he was also 10 pounds heavier than he had been for his fight against Ali. Just as the commentators started making excuses for Frazier's slower movements, he landed a clean left hook right on Foreman's jaw. The crowd gasped. "Foreman has been nailed, and nailed good," said the announcer. Now the question was, how many more clean shots would it take to knock him down? But to everyone's shock, Foreman wasn't hurt at all. In fact, instead of looking nervous, he suddenly looked more relaxed. He stood right in front of Frazier and traded punches, with most of them landing on shoulders and elbows. Then Foreman landed a sharp, quick jab that opened up a perfect spot for his right uppercut. That's when he unleashed. He started throwing wild, heavy punches. Most of them missed, but the ones that landed, they landed hard. Suddenly, a voice rang out from ringside. "Frazier's hurt." It was Angelo Dundee, Muhammad Ali's trainer, who had studied Frazier closely for years. He had seen Frazier in action many times, and from the way Frazier moved, he knew something was wrong. Seconds later, Foreman hit him again with the same left jab, right uppercut combination. This time, it was even cleaner. Frazier went down, and then Howard Cosell made history by shouting the now iconic words, "Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!" The fight wasn't just an upset. It was a demolition. And in one night, George Foreman went from being a joke to being the most feared man on the planet.